A call came in on what seemed like an ordinary morning. When Genoa City was still buried in the cold rhythm of calculations and ambitions that never rested. Sally was trying to hold on to the rare sense of stability she had managed to build after days filled with uncertainty, when her future, her love, and her career all hung like a thread stretched to its breaking point. But one vibration from her phone was enough to pull her straight into a depth she was not prepared for. On the other end of the line was the laboratory. The cold, clinical voice of a medical staff member spoke with a precision that felt almost cruel, delivering results Sally had never imagined possible. Numbers, genetic analyses, DNA markers that should have been meaningless suddenly turned into sharp blades, slicing through every belief she had been clinging to. The fetus she was carrying did not match Billy Abbott genetically. In that moment, Sally's world came to a complete standstill. There was no surrounding noise, no passing cars outside, no soft morning light anymore. Only a freezing sensation spreading through her entire body, from her chest down to her fingertips. She could not breathe deeply, could not react immediately, only a prolonged silence, like a void tearing through her mind. When the call ended, the phone slipped from her hand without her even realizing it. Sally stood frozen, eyes wide yet empty. What she had just heard was not merely medical information, it was the collapse of a reality she had been desperately trying to construct. Billy Abbott, the man she believed to be the father of her child, was suddenly pushed out of that position by an undeniable truth. But what hurt Sally even more than the test results were the memories that began to surface, fragmented pieces like shattered glass inside her mind. A blurred night, alcohol, emotional chaos, and decisions she had tried so hard to bury. She had believed she was in control of everything, that those moments of losing direction would never return to destroy her present. But memories do not disappear, they only wait for the right moment to rise again and dismantle every remaining illusion. Sally felt panic creeping through every breath she took. If it wasn't Billy, then who was it? That question was no longer just about one man, it became a doubt about herself, about the boundaries she had once believed she would never cross. Elsewhere in the city, Billy Abbott was absorbed in thoughts about business, endless corporate tensions, and the power struggles he was constantly pulled into whether he wanted them or not. He had no idea that at that very moment, his personal life was being threatened by a truth that could destroy everything he had built. As information began leaking through unofficial channels, a wave of suspicion quickly spread. Not everyone knew the full truth, but in the world of the Abbotts and the Newmans, even a single fragment of information was enough to turn everything into a battlefield. Suspicious glances began turning towards Sally, not only from outsiders, but also from those who had once stood by her side. Adam Newman was the first to sense the instability. In his quiet observation, he realized something was slipping out of control, a potential opportunity or a coming disaster. His instincts never missed the smallest signs, Sally avoiding people's eyes, the subtle changes in behavior around her, and especially the growing imbalance in her relationship with Billy. Nick Newman also refused to stay out of it. He saw the danger not only on a personal level but in the wider consequences it could bring to the Newman family if mishandled. But what unsettled him most was the feeling that everything was escalating beyond anyone's control. Sally tried to stay calm, but inside her was a storm with no end. She no longer knew whether to trust her memories or the test results. Every option led to a different form of collapse. If she told the truth, she could lose Billy. If she stayed silent, she would continue living in deception and self-doubt. But Genoa City had never allowed secrets to remain buried for long. Relationships were tested, alliances broken, and even the strongest people could be pushed to their limits by a single truth. Billy began noticing the change in the way Sally looked at him. Not a clear distance, but something like guilt, fear, as if a door between them was slowly closing. He did not understand why, and that lack of understanding slowly turned into anger, quiet, but dangerous. Sally withdrew into isolation. She no longer trusted her own judgment, no longer felt certain about what had happened that fateful night. Every memory was distorted by guilt and confusion. She began questioning not only the father of her child, but her own identity, and the moral boundaries she once believed she would never cross. Meanwhile, the surrounding forces began to shift. No one said it directly, but everyone understood that the truth about this child was not just a personal matter. It could become a weapon, a leverage point in the already tense power struggles between families. A secret of lineage had the potential to destabilize entire empires that once seemed unshakable. Sally felt the pressure tightening from all sides. Silence was no longer a safe choice, it had become a double-edged blade. The longer she kept it hidden, the greater the risk of exposure. But if she revealed it herself, she would be the one to destroy everything with her own hands. Anger began to form within her, not directed at a single person, but at the situation itself, at the cruel irony of fate. At decisions in her past that she could no longer undo. It was no longer simple fear. It was suppressed rage, an emotion capable of exploding at any moment. In the darkness of manipulation and suspicion, the truth about the child inside Sally became the center of a forming storm. Every person drawn into it had their own reason to protect, attack, or conceal. And as the masks began to fall, no one could predict who would be the first to be crushed. Sally stood at the center of it all, no longer the one controlling her story, but the focal point of a chain reaction she could no longer stop. Every choice became a trade-off, every silence an indirect confession, and every step a possible descent into irreversible collapse. In a world where trust is fragile and truth always comes at a price. The secret of the child was no longer just a question of paternity, it was the trigger for a chain of conflicts that could change everything. And when the final storm broke, no one would remain the same again. The silence after the call did not last long, because it quickly became the loudest sound in Sally's mind. Every passing second felt like an interrogation without words, pulling her deeper into a spiral of doubt and fear. She no longer knew what was real memory and what her mind was reconstructing to protect itself. But the most cruel truth was the growing realization that no matter what the truth actually was, she had already lost control over it. She began to avoid everything related to Billy Abbott. Not through a clear break, but through subtle actions that carried heavy meaning, delayed replies to messages, postponed meetings, and eyes that constantly drifted away whenever he came close. Billy felt the change like a fracture slowly spreading through the foundation of what he believed was still stable. At first, he tried to explain it away as work pressure or emotional instability on Sally's side. But the more it continued, the harder it became to ignore the growing sense of unease. Meanwhile, Sally was secretly trying to verify the test results. A part of her refused to accept the truth, or at least refused to accept the way it was rewriting her entire life. She began questioning the laboratory, the procedures, even the rare but possible margin of error. But the deeper she investigated, the clearer it became that everything had been handled with near-perfect accuracy. And that only made her panic worse, because it forced her to confront the possibility she feared most. That her own memory might be the only truth left. Fragments of that memory began to return in a cruel sequence. Not vague impressions anymore, but clear sensations of losing control, of decisions driven by emotion. Of a night where the boundary between right and wrong had completely dissolved. She remembered convincing herself that nothing mattered, that consequences would never catch up to her. But Genoa City had never been kind to such illusions. Sally's panic gradually transformed into a colder state of tension. She no longer cried or reacted impulsively. Instead, she became disturbingly quiet. That silence itself began to attract attention. Not everyone knew the truth, but everyone could sense that a secret was forming, growing heavier with each passing hour. Adam Newman was the first to act deliberately. He did not need the full truth to recognize that a weakness was forming in the web connecting Sally and Billy. For Adam, fractures like this were not dangers, they were opportunities. He began collecting information quietly, observing patterns instead of confronting directly. And the more he observed, the more he realized this instability could be exploited if handled correctly. Nick Newman, on the other hand, felt the danger rising in a different way. He did not believe in coincidences, especially not ones that lingered without consequence. In Sally's avoidance, in Billy's growing confusion, he saw the early signs of a collapse forming not through direct confrontation, but through the slow erosion of trust. Billy started questioning himself. Not others, but his own memory. He tried to reconstruct every moment, every interaction, every subtle shift in Sally's behavior. But the effort revealed something far more disturbing. There were gaps in his recollection that he could not fill. And in those gaps, every possibility became real. Sally, meanwhile, was trapped in a suffocating psychological state. She understood that the longer she stayed silent, the more others would begin searching for answers on their own. And once that happened, she would no longer control the narrative. Yet every time she considered revealing the truth, she froze under the fear of losing everything: Billy, stability, and the fragile identity she had been rebuilding after years of instability. A small turning point came when Sally received indirect information about how the DNA sample had been handled. A detail that seemed insignificant at first, but enough to make her question everything again. There was a slim possibility of internal mislabeling during transport, not a system failure, but human error. That single possibility, however fragile, was enough to ignite a dangerous spark of hope inside her. She began investigating more carefully, tracing the entire process step by step, searching for inconsistencies. But the deeper she went, the more entangled she became in unclear data and incomplete records. There were hints of irregularities, but nothing definitive. And that ambiguity trapped her between two equally destructive realities: a truth that could destroy her life, or a fragile hope that everything was simply a mistake. While Sally wrestled with her internal chaos, Billy's frustration began to grow. He was no longer dealing with vague intuition. The emotional distance between them had become undeniable. Sally was withdrawing, avoiding, and hiding something he could not reach. That sense of exclusion slowly transformed into anger, not explosive, but building layer by layer. Billy was not used to being kept outside a truth that directly affected his life. And as the feeling of being shut out deepened, it turned into a need for answers, no matter the cost. Elsewhere in the city, others began to sense that this was no longer just a private issue between Sally and Billy. It had become a convergence point where relationships, trust, power, and past mistakes were colliding. And when those forces intersected, the outcome was never contained. Sally found herself increasingly isolated by her own secret. She no longer knew who she could trust, no longer had certainty about anything, including herself. The anger inside her no longer pointed outward. It turned inward instead, transforming into self-reproach, then hardened into emotional detachment. She began to understand that regardless of the truth, the moment it came out would mark a point of no return. And as the final pieces of the situation began moving into place, Genoa City once again prepared itself for collapse. Not an immediate explosion, but a chain reaction of breakdowns beginning from a secret that seemed personal but was in fact deeply connected to everyone who had ever placed there trust in her. No one remained safe. And the cruelest part was this: when the truth finally emerged, it would not simply answer one question, it would destroy every answer anyone had ever believed in.